begin. Well, good morning, and thank you for making time in your schedule to be with us today. We're a team of 4 educators from Amphitheater School District, and that's in Tucson, Arizona. We're really excited to share our 7th grade Earth and Space unit with you today. Okay. My name is Pam Vandevort, and I'm the K-12 Science and STEM Coordinator for the district. I previously taught 8th grade science, 6th to 8th grade STEM elective, and high school biotech. And with me are
Leslie Ferre, who almost forgot to unmute. I have been teaching STEM from preschool up to middle school for the last 10 years. And we also have?
Oh, I'll go. I'm Kyle Sutton. I teach at Wilson K-8 here in Tucson. I specialize in 6th grade, but I've taught all middle school science levels. And I'm just finishing up my doctorate degree now in quantum cognition. And then Lauren?
Yep, and my name is Lauren Marlatt, and I teach 7th grade science primarily. I also teach engineering and robotics. And this will be my 15th year teaching mostly 7th grade science. I've taught 6th grade science as well, but mostly 7th grade science.
Okay, as we present our unit, please feel free to type in any questions that you may have. Please use the chat box. If we don't address them during our presentation, we will do so during the question and answer session at the end of our presentation. So our 7th grade Earth and Space unit sequences the standards from an outside-in approach, which we've titled Journey to the Center of Our Earth. Since we begin the unit in the Earth's atmosphere, and then we journey downward, ending up at the lithosphere. And the big ideas in each of our learning sequences are, in the first learning sequence, the sun is the Earth's main source of energy, and it's cycled through the biosphere, the hydrosphere, and the atmosphere. And then in learning sequence 2, what happens to the sun's energy on Earth? The energy in these systems creates patterns of phenomena that can be used to make predictions. And then in learning sequence 3, energy cycling in the geosphere results in plate tectonics. It's driven by radioactive decay inside the Earth, which mirrors how the sun provides energy for the Earth's other systems. And we'll take a look at our anchor phenomena in all 3 sequences. In learning sequence 1, living on the moon would require materials to cycle as they do on Earth. Learning sequence 2, the wildfires in Australia are developing their own weather systems. And learning sequence 3, there are reptile fossils in Antarctica. And so we'll begin going through our unit at learning sequence 1.
So for learning sequence 1, the guiding question we used for the whole sequence is, how could humans colonize the moon? And before we move on, I just wanted to point out that the guiding questions are not necessarily for student consumption. They're meant to sort of give an overview to the instructor for how the instruction is guided over the course of the sequence. So we'll be covering 2 standards in this sequence, looking at the cycling of matter and flow of energy in the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and you'll notice that we've crossed out geosphere. That will be covered in a later sequence. So this one just focuses on atmosphere and hydrosphere. And the second one is looking at photosynthesis, essentially. The SCPs, the science and engineering practices that students will be using the most, are developing and using models, as well as asking questions and defining problems. And the cross-cutting concepts are systems and system models, as well as energy and matter. So the engage part of the lesson starts right off with a video presented by Jim Bridenstine. He's actually talking to a group of contractors or potential contractors announcing NASA's mission to the moon in 2024. It's a pretty sort of, the music is engaging and theatrical, and it's a pretty exciting video, I'm not gonna lie. So then once students are shown that video saying we're going to the moon, then they're given a mission brief and told that they're going to be designing a moon outpost that could support human life. The idea for us behind this was that it would sort of force students to hone in on the nitty-gritty of what we need to support life, and therefore be able to understand how stuff cycles in a smaller version of, you know, rather than trying to tackle it on a global scale. But first, students go outside. Our philosophy in the explore part is always to start where students are most comfortable, tapping into their intuitive understanding and instinctive knowledge about whatever it is they're going to be studying. So in this case, students go outside and they just sit down under a tree, or, you know, ideally somewhere shady, because this will be early in Arizona. And they record their observations about what they see or hear or smell and think is sustaining life here on Earth. And I did this with my students, and I found they were very engaged and their lists were quite comprehensive. So we do sort of want students to start building a list of kind of what we actually need. You know, I think we had a lot of discussions about the fact that every student is going to include Wi-Fi on their lunar outpost. So which is great, but we also want to make sure they remember air and water and some of the more necessary things. But because this is an explore and because it's inquiry learning, we don't want to tell the students what to include. So the first pass at getting them to hone their lists or maybe find some things that they didn't think of individually was to do a give one, get one. So students would have their list of what they think is needed, and then they would walk around and share with each other and create a list of what they think are sort of the most important basics. And we're hoping through this, they'll cast most of the basics of air, sun, water, but first of all, they do not need to catch all of them at this point. And secondly, this information is not coming from the teacher. So then students take their list and they complete the initial design of their lunar outpost. Again, you know, there will most likely be some glaring issues, but at this stage of the game, that's okay, because, you know, science is about modifying our understanding as we get new knowledge. So this is an opportunity for students to practice that habit. And so they will be modifying this design as they go through the rest of the sequence. So this is really their first attempt. Our linking question takes us from the engage to the first explore. And again, just like the guiding questions, these are not necessarily for student consumption, especially, you know, in inquiry learning, you don't really want to tell them the end of where they're going to go, but for teachers, we want to know where the story is headed. So the teacher does ask students to talk about the most important thing that's needed that humans need to survive. And on this one, we really do need them to get to air. And so we had a back and forth discussion about whether, you know, this is one of those things that's negotiable, and, you know, it isn't. I think we can all agree that we need air before we need anything else. So in our tool 4, there are different strategies depending on sort of the level of struggle or even pushback that you're getting from students. You know, if you get a student who says, I think it's internet access. And so, you know, I think we decided you could easily address that by saying, okay, well, let's vote. Who would rather go 1 minute without internet access or 1 minute without breathing? And, you know, you'll get there eventually. So then students conduct very simple, very accessible experiments comparing in air, which is the air they're breathing in, the air that's all around them, and out air, the air that they breathe out. It starts with them breathing, collecting a sample of atmospheric air in a Ziploc bag, and then breathing into a Ziploc bag, you know, which right away they'll see the humidity in the Ziploc bag versus the ambient air. And at this point, we do not need them to call it oxygen, carbon dioxide, identify any of those components. We really just want them to see that what I breathe in is not the same as what I breathe out. Moving from explore to explain, that's where we start looking at it and putting the scientific vocabulary onto it and a sort of more accepted understanding of what's going on. So in the explain, students are going to do research two ways. They're going to do some readings, but they're also going to do an experiment. And at the end of it, they will have identified that those 3 bullet points. Humans need in air to include oxygen. Humans and animals exhale carbon dioxide. And plants take in sunlight and carbon dioxide and produce oxygen using photosynthesis. And I deliberately didn't write O2 and CO2 on the slides because we're not talking necessarily at the level of the chemical formulas at this point. Nothing against them, but they don't need to be known. So this is a photo from the video of the experiment. We use Elodea plants, and students submerge the Elodea plants in water, and they count bubbles when the plant is in darkness or not under a light, and to the number of bubbles when the plant is under a light. And it's pretty cool. I haven't seen it live. Pam, you did it live, right?
I've seen it live. It is really dynamic. Yes. Photosynthesis in action.
So now we've established oxygen, CO2, and sort of touched on photosynthesis, and now we're going to move on to water. And first thing we're going to do is have students diagram their local or individual water cycle. And again, we're trying to reach students where they are. And so the way we want this to work, because the idea is a water cycle. And not necessarily the components of the water cycle that we've all seen on every diagram. So, if one student says, well, I get it from the tap, okay, so they write down tap, and then the teacher says, well, and where does that water come from? And you're going to lead them through an entire cycle by asking them, successively, and where does that water come from? And then students are going to build physical models. This again is going to be done partially, at least outside, to have some sunlight. And basically the idea is that they show whatever component of the water cycle they can. There could be simple, so the top one is just a black plastic tray with saran wrap on top, and it's just going to show evaporation and condensation. Or the one on the bottom is a Coke bottle that was almost completely split in half with a toothpick holding it slightly open, covered completely with saran wrap, but it should be catching evaporation, condensation, and the water should be running down the slope of the top of the bottle. So you should have, some runoff or whatever you want to call it. The idea was that this could be differentiated at many levels. And again, they'll create a complete cycle as long as water's not escaping, which is kind of what we're going for here. And then they share their designs with each other, and they learn from each other about, oh, I forgot to include that in mine. So now they've thought about where they get their water from and their local water cycle, and now they're going to sort of map it onto or incorporate it into the global water cycle. And they do that. To do that, they start with sorting cards. And on the next slide, it shows examples of all 3 of the components of the sorting card. So there are pictures, there are words of locations of water, and there are words of processes of water with arrows on them. So, and there are pictures from Arizona as well as all around the world. And they start without any information again, and they create as much of a global water cycle or idea of sort of larger scale water cycle as they can on their own. And then they're given resources that they can use to add to that water cycle. But at the end, they should have a general understanding of how water cycles on Earth. Then they take what they've learned from that exercise, and they go back to the lunar outpost, and they make sure that their lunar outpost water cycle is complete. And as I say that, I remember that I forgot to mention at the end of Explain 1 that they do go back, once they have that O2, CO2 photosynthesis, they do go back and revise it, their lunar outpost at the end of Explain 1. I apologize for leaving that out. So now we need to move their thinking towards the idea that the sun is the engine that drives all of these processes. And we do that through, they do that through research. And basically they're going to write a CER. They're going to make a claim about what drives carbon and water cycles on Earth. And they'll back up that claim using evidence and reasoning. And then they finalize the design of their outpost and they present it and defend it to their peers. This actually, I included this one. This is a student designed outpost that they designed using Minecraft. And I wanted to bring this in as a way to highlight that it doesn't, students, we can meet them where they are. So if their tool of choice is Minecraft, then, more power to them. And if you can get them to work on science at home, that's even better. So now we're ready to move on to the evaluate, by looking at the question of, has anybody ever tried to build one of these self-contained outposts before? And, because we're Arizonans, we know about Biosphere 2, and we know it was not maybe the success that they had hoped for. So the evaluate component is students learning about Biosphere 2 and then explaining what went wrong. So in order for them to do that, they need to understand how oxygen, carbon dioxide, and matter were cycling inside the biosphere.
Okay, moving on to sequence 2. Kyle?
Yep. So for learning sequence 2, again, kind of beginning off, the guiding question is, how can weather prediction help humans during climate change events? And then the standards we get to, there's 2 main standards that we're really addressing, and 3 main SCPs, and then 3 Common Cores. Again, we're not getting to the geosphere yet. We are still just focusing on weather. That's coming in the next sequence. But you're really going to see, and I kind of wanted to point out here, the SCPs, and especially the SCPs and the cross-cutting concepts, how well they kind of integrate to the storyline and the narrative of the standards. And that's one of those things, by connecting them, it creates a very clear storyline. Next. So to begin, we're having the kids get a set of graphs and a set of word statements, and they're going to make, they're playing a matching game. This is one of those things that we are not giving them any information from the teacher. This is all just data that we have gotten from credible sources, and kind of statements that lead the students to make connections. I think there's some more examples here. There we go. And then the teacher's not feeding them this information. Next slide. There we go. The students are going to divide up into the groups, and they're going to discuss their matches. And this is one of those times that's important to kind of point out that this is the inquiry. This is the time where you get to see what kind of intrinsic knowledge your kids already have, maybe any personal connections and common misconceptions. And this is where, and especially in middle school, getting students to actively engage in communication where they're talking about science can be hard. So playing a game like this is one of those ways it's easy to get kids engaged and involved, and it allows them to kind of discuss their thinking in a very comfortable way, so you get a lot out of it just by introducing these basic ideas. At the end of this discussion over these matching cards, we're leading the kids to come up with their own definitions, their own understanding of climate versus weather. And this is something we'll come back to a lot throughout the lesson, but right now it's important that they get this basic concept and that they come up with their understanding on their own. So to end the engage, we go back to wildfires in Australia, which you can tell this was, we started writing this a year ago when fire in Australia was the most exciting thing going on in the world at the time. Seems nice now. But after reading this article, the kids are going to share their thoughts about how fire is creating weather changes in Australia. And this is going to be a phenomenon we come back to and use to connect throughout the lesson. So our linking question, again, something probably more for the teacher, not necessarily something you want to show the student to tell them where they're going. But how do we measure weather, and how do we use data to predict future weather? And again, this is directly connecting to the SEPs and cross-cutting standards we're looking for. So the Explore one, students are going to work together, and they're going to do research on different ways of measuring and recording weather data, different tools we have. They're going to do some research and discovery about how these tools work. Next. And then they're actually going to build their selected weather tool. And then they're going to use these to record the data for that day, and then they're going to make predictions for the next day. They're using their own data, they're making their own predictions, they're analyzing their own data. So this is one of those where the process is simple, but what the students should be getting out of it is quite a bit, not just in terms of the information they're gathering, but really in the process of how to be a scientific thinker. So next linking question, getting into the explain, how it has recording data allowed us to observe weather changes over time. So this would be something you're probably coming back to the next day after the building and making your predictions for the weather. Students are going to share what predictions they made, and then they're going to analyze and rank the accuracy of that information. Who was able to get the most accurate predictions and use out of their information. And then the students groups are going to develop ways of linking their information and working together. So now they're going to share as a class what predictions they recorded, and then they're going to talk about which weather tools actually contribute the most valuable information. And I will, Pam, can you go back just for one second? I kind of forgot to mention, I wanted to point out too, because it's one of those important connecting things. This is one of those times when the students are communicating and talking to one another, and it's important to kind of add to this while the students are discussing how important communication is. Not just the science, but the development of communication allows for more collection of data. So you're teaching the kids that, no, this collaboration with your class and your peers isn't something we're just doing. This is how science works. You need other people's data points and understandings to develop your own. Thank you, Pam. You can go to the next slide now.
Okay.
So now we're linking to the next Explore. How have advances really helped in weather predictions? So we're going back to the Australia wildfires here. Students are going to do some research and learn about weather patterns and climate changes in Australia's over time. And they're going to make a simple KWL chart from that so they can express what they learned and what they want to know and what they learned. Here's just a simple example of something you can expect. And here's a few examples of the data. Again, I wanted to make sure we put this up to show them that the teacher isn't giving them this information. The teacher is providing this data and working towards the goal of them analyzing this and coming up with a reasonable and rational explanation. Remember, this is inquiry, so if their rational explanation isn't 100% correct, this is where you are doing the teaching. This is where you're going to help as the class focus in on the correct ideas and what is driving this change. So the next linking question to the explain to, how do changes in weather patterns change climate? So to begin, we were starting to introduce these new concepts now. To introduce like the greenhouse effect, where you simply ask kids, you're laying at home under a blanket, it gets warm under that blanket, where is the heat coming from? How is the heat getting trapped under that blanket? And that's when that discussion is going to lead to us playing a video about the greenhouse effect to introduce that. And go to the next slide. And then the students are going to work together on this climate time machine, which is a very cool NASA website. It just shows the weather data of Earth throughout time, really concentrating on sea ice, sea level, carbon dioxide, and global temperature. And this is one of those things kids can interact with this website, and they just start to develop an understanding of the changes to Earth's climate over time and the things that are driving that. So students are going to make the connection here between Earth's climate changes and the rise in CO2 in the atmosphere, and then make that connection of, okay, where is this CO2 coming from? And then how is human impact driving that CO2 gain? And that's when we build into this elaborate. So how do other factors such as latitude and ocean currents affect weather and climate? So we really introduced quite a few concepts here and made sure the kids understand it. And now we're introducing this new variable. So now they have to take this new concept of weather, atmospheric currents and everything and add that in. Hold on, my screen just, there we go. And add that in to their understanding. So to do this, the students are going to design a couple different experiments. The first is a water current experiment, which is really cool, and it's one of those things where it's very visual and easy to gain the concept. And then we're going to, once they understand how currents connected to land work, okay, now they're going to make a prediction of how that affects the wildfires in Australia. And then we get to latitude as well, and especially us students living in North America, it's one of those things when you introduce the concept, Southern Hemisphere works a little bit different, and weather and summer don't always line up as you think they might. This can be a new concept, and it's one of those that is great for them to build off of, because that understanding is going to allow them to apply this basic weather and climate understanding to anywhere in their world. So now we've taken this focus from Australia, but it should be applicable anywhere. And that gets us to our evaluate. What impact can human activity and climate change have on a biome? So for the evaluate, we've talked about the Australian biome and the wildfires going on there. We reviewed all these weather and climate factors and the variables in it. So now for the evaluation, we're going to have them do the same thing, just set in a different location. The taiga biome, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. So would wildfires in other places in the taiga biome in this example have similar effects on climate? So this is one of those fun activities. Now the students are going to set the task of, you're going to create a weather forecast, and you're going to use all these variables, all weather and climate over time, temperature, humidity, all the data points that we've collected. You're going to build that all together and use that to answer this question about this new region and about human activity and impacts of the wildlife. They're going to get to make a weather forecast. And this is one of those things where not only will kids be involved and invested, it really is a great way for them to show their own understanding of the data and expressing their own analysis and giving rationale behind it, which it makes it easy for you to see, yep, they got the main concepts, and it really allows you to have the students become that lifelong learner, that person who is going out to find their own rationale in science.
Okay. Moving on to learning sequence 3. Lauren.
Yes. All right, so for learning sequence 3, our guiding question, again, guiding the teacher into what's expected to be taught, kind of what our end goal is what do reptile fossils in Antarctica have to do with plate tectonics? As far as our standards, we're focusing on another standard that we haven't gotten to yet in this unit about the distribution of fossils and rocks, continental shapes, and seafloor structures, providing evidence of past plate motion. And also, we're getting back to that thing we've crossed out in the previous 2 learning sequences of how does stuff cycle and flow in the geosphere. The SEPs we're using are analyzing and interpreting data, mostly, also constructing explanations and planning and carrying out investigations. And then there's a whole bunch of cross-cutting concepts that are kind of intertwined together as we work our way through of stability and change, cause and effect, energy and matter, and structure and function. So for our engage, we're really gonna try and kind of surprise the kids a little bit with this phenomena. So what they're going to do is they're going to look at reptiles, and then they're going to be introduced to this Antarctica fossil. So what they're gonna do first is just talk about reptiles. So they're gonna identify kind of what they know about reptiles and how they live and where they live and what they need. So they're gonna kind of fill out this kind of reptile fact sheet almost with what they think. It doesn't have to be specific information. They're not doing any research. They're just kind of identifying, what do I know about reptiles? You know, where would they live? Would it be cold? How long would it be cold? Would it be hot? How long would it be hot? What do they eat? What kind of plants do they need? What other kind of animals would be there with them, right? Really kind of creating a picture. And then we do have in there for them to actually draw it as well. And then they're going to look at a map and they're going to say, where on the earth would I find them? So like, where would that actual place be? Once they've done that, you're going to kind of turn it on its head and show them the reptile fossil from Antarctica. So you'll show them this. This is more recent than the dinosaurs. Okay, so this is a newer fossil. And you're going to show this to them and then show them where that it was found in Antarctica. It's supposedly, the artist rendition is like the bottom left there, that iguana type reptile. And then we're going to try and figure it out. So we're going to go back to the map. This map actually shows reptile distribution. You didn't have to tell them that before because we just needed places. But this is reptile distribution all over the earth. And they can look and see how many reptiles are in Antarctica. There are none. So there are no reptiles currently in Antarctica. And then at the end of Engage, what you're going to do is just have them kind of figure out what they think. Like, how could that be there? So if reptiles can't live in Antarctica, why do we find reptile fossils in Antarctica? And they're just going to write down their own ideas. It doesn't matter if they're right or not, because we're going to work our way through those as we go. Our linking question from Engage to Explore 1 is, how could the reptile fossils be found in Antarctica? So we're kind of just taking off from that end of the Engage. Go ahead. So what they're going to do in their Explore 1 is they're going to kind of take these ideas and build on them just a little bit. So to start with, we're going to show them a climate map. So this is a climate map of the different climates, and they should be fairly familiar with this since they just came off of learning about climate and weather, and not necessarily with this exact map, but the idea that there are different climate zones. And they're going to compare that to the reptile map that we showed in the Engage, and they're going to kind of get an idea that, again, they were right? Reptiles need a certain type of climate. And we're going to kind of stretch them a little bit and say, okay, well, if a reptile right now needs that type of climate, does it make sense that reptiles that lived in the past would need that type of climate? And most of them are going to get to yes. You're going to get some pushback from kids going, oh, no, I bet they could live in the cold before, and I bet they could do this, I bet they could do that. But you're just trying to kind of get them to start thinking about how things change or when things change. And then after they kind of put that together, they're going to brainstorm all their lists. So right now, after the Engage, they had their own idea of how the reptile fossil could get there. And at the end of our Explore, we're going to create kind of a class list of all the different ways that we think the reptile fossil got to Antarctica. You know, it swam there, it got pushed there, somebody, bigger reptile picked it up and ate it and dropped the bones there, whatever they say is fine. And then we're going to get into the explain, where we start to try and figure out what actually makes sense based on what we can figure out data wise. So it says for our linking question, how do we know which ideas, that's okay, is the most likely explanation? So how are we going to figure out what the most likely explanation is? Go ahead. So now we're going to use an activity where they're going to start looking at fossil evidence and how that got there. So what they're going to do is they're going to look at other fossil evidence. So we're not looking at the Antarctica fossil. That's something that you really want to kind of point out. None of these things that are on this activity are the same fossil that we're looking at. These are all other fossils for us to explore. So they're going to look at the other fossil evidence, and what they're going to do is just one part of this activity that we got out of a different resource, where they're going to color using this color code. They're going to color all of their fossils, and then once they've colored them, each kid gets one continent. They're going to lay them out, and they're going to find other kids that have different continent than they do, and they're going to use a current world map and just figure out what continent they are. I know it's kind of easy to assume they'll know right off the bat, but they don't necessarily know. And so it's good for them to kind of put, you know, oh, this is South America and this is Africa. Those are the easy ones. And then the others are not so easy. So then they have to kind of put them out and figure out where they go. And then they're going to start looking at what they show. So they're looking for things that kind of stand out to them. And hopefully what will stand out either on their own or maybe with a little bit of teacher guidance is that there's more than just reptile fossils. There are plant fossils too. And especially on Antarctica, there are plant fossils. And so they're going to start to figure out that, oh, there's more than just reptile fossils, and they're kind of all over the place. So even if I'm really holding on to my idea that something could swim, even though it doesn't look like it could swim and they're telling me it couldn't swim, plants can't necessarily swim. So now I've got to start to kind of piece that together. So after I do that, after we kind of look at similarities and differences and what these pieces of evidence are showing us, we're going to try and put them together. So kind of think Alfred Wegener and his idea of continental drift, right? So we're going to fit them all together. This is a sample of what it could look like. Not all of the kids are going to get it perfectly like this. So it might take a little bit of kind of teacher shoving to get them to here. But they should be able to kind of match up all of the fossils and see that the fossils are all kind of in a certain pattern. And what we're going to do with that information is, after we make some observations, we're going to go back and we're going to look at our list of ways that our Antarctica fossil got there. And hopefully we're starting to see that the continents had to move. Hopefully we're starting to see that these pieces of land had to move, because that's the only way that these things could get to where they are, and could be similar across different pieces of land. Go ahead. So after we kind of discovered that, we're going to get into our second explore explain sequence or cycle. So our next explore is going to get at how are they moving. So we kind of got them to the idea that everything moved. So now we've got to try and figure out what causes them to move. So with the explore, we really kind of stretched, and what the students are going to do is try to figure out what could cause something solid to move, something like the continents. And so what they're going to do is they're going to brainstorm what they think could cause movement. And then we're going to take some of, just in my experience, some of the most common ideas, and we're going to investigate them. So the most common ideas that students usually tell me are that there's magnetic stuff in the rock, and there's a magnetic field around the earth, so it's magnets that are causing the continents to move. Water is pushing the continents, right? There's a big ocean that's pushing the continents around. And then we're gonna investigate heat, because we need to investigate heat. That might not be one that comes up with the students, but as soon as we say, you know, oh, we're gonna investigate heat, usually some of them already know kind of the connections with heat transfer and movement. And then some of them are going to get there when you say heat, because they're going to come off of the previous 2 learning sequences where we've been talking about heat from the sun. You know, oh yeah, that makes sense. So we're going to investigate, can we move solid objects with these things? And does that movement look like what we see on the Earth? Like, do we have observations to kind of support that could be our driving force? So they're going to go through and just do some very simple experiments with magnets and with heat transfer, with all kinds of heat transfer, radiation, conduction, convection, and also just with moving water and wave type simulations, and see if they can move bigger things or move solid objects. And they're just going to collect all of that data, and that's our explore. And then for our explain, we're going to start kind of processing all of that. So in the explore, you're going to have a lot of really frustrated kids. They're going to think they did stuff wrong because there's a lot that doesn't work. Because they're going to say, okay, well, the magnets were fun. They were fun to play with. You even gave us some magnetic, you know, some magnetite and some rocks that, you know, have magnetic properties. And we were able to pull them, but we can't push them with the magnets the same way that we would expect them to push. And it looks like some of the things moved one way and some of the things moved the other. I can't do both unless I physically force the magnets around. And so they're going to get frustrated, or nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to move, right? Nothing's going to move with the radiation the way we did it. Nothing's going to move with the convection the way we did it. So they're going to have a lot of nothing. There was no movement. I watched for 2 minutes. There was nothing happening. And that's really going to drive home the fact that not all of these possibilities are supported. So the only one that's really going to work well is convection. And what we're going to do with that is kind of apply that. We're going to say, okay, convection was the one that we saw that worked well. Let's see if we can figure out if convection is driving it in the Earth. So we have to do a quick review of the layers of the Earth. It's not really something we're teaching, but we're just kind of pulling back what they hopefully have learned in the past and kind of giving it the context that we need in order to investigate convection and heat. After we've looked at the layers of the Earth, they're going to do an experiment together as a class to kind of look at how convection or movement in a fluid can cause movement. So they're going to walk through kind of a pretty standard experiment for you, but now that they have all this background knowledge, it actually is a little more powerful. I found that this was a lot more powerful and students were understanding a lot more what they were looking at than when I used to introduce it. I used to start with this and then go to other things. But they're going to look at how the heat transfers in convection, and then they're going to try and figure out, go to the next one. And then they're going to try and figure out what that means for the Earth. They're also going to look at where the heat's coming from. So there's a video that's thrown in there about radioactive decay inside the core of the Earth and how we have these heat things, you know, leftovers from the Earth's formation, radioactive decay, pressure building up in the layers, and that heat has to move because heat's always transferring. So once they put that together and they see all these visualizations in these labs, they can start to kind of really understand that heat's driving the plates and that things are moving. And that leads us to our elaborate. So in our elaborate, we tried to attack it from what other evidence do we have that things are moving, it's because of convection, and these fossils could get there in that way. So before we get back to the Antarctica fossil, we've got to look for other evidence. So what they're going to do is first they're going to look at a map. This is a map from This Dynamic Planet. And they're just going to write down observations of what they see. So now they're not looking at fossils. They're looking at land features, right? Volcanoes, earthquakes, which aren't land features, but they show earthquakes on here. Also, it has the plates delineated and trenches and fault lines. And they're going to collect all of these observations and they're going to talk about where these things are. And they're usually on the edges of plates, right? Mountains as well. So they're usually on the edges of the plates. And then we're going to try and figure out why. Why are those on the edges of the plates? And in order to figure that out, they're going to do kind of like a web quest activity or a web activity. I'm using a couple of really cool websites to look at the people, because I also figured that we haven't really looked at who else figured this out besides just us really smart 7th graders in our classroom, right? Who else figured out that these things are moving and how they're moving and why they're moving and where they're going. And then also kind of the plate boundaries. So we're coming from figuring out that a lot of these things are on the edges of the plates. So now we want to look at why. What's causing them to form on the edges of the plates? Where are the plates going? What does that do? Once they're done with that, they're going to look at a map that shows them just a kind of a broader picture online of where the plates are moving. Kind of, it has the really explicit, you can see their arrows of where things are moving. And that gets them to kind of put the last piece in there. Once they have all those pieces in there, they're going to come back to their Antarctica fossil. So they're going to come back to their Antarctica fossil and they're going to write a CER answering the question, why are there reptile fossils in Antarctica? So how did they get there? What could have caused them to form in that area? So they're going to create their claim. They're going to use everything from both explore, explain sequences as their evidence and kind of reason out why that makes sense. And then for their elaborate, so leading us into the elaborate, we're going to look at,
Evaluate.
to the evaluate, from the elaborate to the evaluate. We're going to look at, are the plates still moving, right? Because a lot of times students tend to stop. They're like, oh, okay, you showed me what happened on the edge of the plates, so we're done. So we're going to evaluate, we're going to say, what would happen in the future? So what they're going to do is they're going to take a look at where they just ended, and they're going to say, okay, 50 million years in the future, where are all of these things going to be? What are we going to see, right, based on how they're moving now? And what are the land features? What's going to tell me, if I was a student then, what's going to tell me what happened and how it happened? So what they're going to do that is make some kind of stop motion video, or if you don't have computer access that's easy for all students, then like kind of think of like a flip book, comic book type thing where they're going to kind of draw the progression and then kind of share that with the class. There are some already, as most of us probably know, we've probably seen them online. There are several projections from scientists from very reputable sources that you can show them afterward, but really try to get them to make their own first, right? To really kind of stretch, because this is where you're kind of seeing, do they understand what's moving and how we would know it's moving and what we would see on the surface of the Earth. And that takes you to the end of the learning sequence.
And at the end of each learning sequence, 1, 2, and 3, there will be a performance assessment, and that is tool 5. You got a glimpse of tool 1 in the unit overview, and then we just took you through tool 4, which is the lesson plans. What is the teacher doing? What is the student doing? And what resources are they using? And this would be tool 5, which is the performance assessment. Now there is a four multi-part questions for learning sequence 1. It's under final review as we speak. And then 2 and 3, the performance assessments for learning sequence 2 and 3 are still under construction. Once all of these are completed, they will be linked to the unit on the ASTA website. And so those will also be available for you as soon as they are finished being constructed. And we welcome at this time any questions that you may have, and hopefully we will be able to answer them for you. And we need to check the chat and see if there are any in there.
Or choice, you know, so like if they go, when they go outside in learning sequence 1 and they make observations, that can be as structured as we want. You know, we have freedom to decide if we want them to take really sort of structured field notes or just observations.
And
Awesome.
oh, sorry. I say
Go ahead, Svea.
It's so hard. It's so hard when I can't see everybody.
I know.
I was just going to say, in the workshops that we've done so far, this summer. There is a wide variety of what teachers would prefer to do with each of the writing assignments or observation assignments. So leaving teacher choice in there was really important to us. We didn't want a script necessarily for teachers to just read off of and here, do this, do this, do this. There is a lot of teacher choice in there because teachers know their students, and teachers have their preferences for how they want students to record things. And then even schools have, like school-wide, if you're Avid, then okay, everything needs to be in Avid format, such as Cornell Notes or an interactive notebook. So the freedom of choice, teacher choice, needed to be built in there to allow for all of that, and it does.
Awesome, thank you. It's so hard because this is such a great conversation, but we're out of time. And just to remind everyone that there is another session with this amazing team coming up to talk about Tool Zero at 11. So if you're interested, I'm not sure if the registration is still open or that, but the conversation, yeah, Sarah just did it as well. I was going to reiterate that all of these lessons are on the ASTA website. But really, I want to thank Leslie, Kyle, Lauren, and Pam. Thank you so much. They're from Amphitheater for sharing their unit and their learning with us. Knowing that the new science standards requires teachers to shift the way